Well, welcome everyone. Saludos. And thank you for joining us for today's Wellness Wednesdays, our fourth community engagement and research webinar being hosted by the Juan Antonio Corregel Puerto Rican Cultural Center of Chicago. Developed resources reported in this webinar are supported by the network of the National Library of Medicine, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, under the cooperative agreement. The content is the sole responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of the NIH. The sessions throughout the series will provide health education information and resources. Today, we'll discuss redressing history and inclusive representation of African Americans in research. Our featured guests for today's webinar are Ms. Angela Ellison and Dr. Angela Odoms-Young. But first, we'll hear from COO of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Juan Manuel Calderon. He will provide information about the Puerto Rican Cultural Center and how it is rooted in honoring and embracing history through education, arts, and culture. We're also joined, or we'll hear a word from our program sponsor, Darlene Caskey, who is from the University of Iowa, as she will share resources from the National Library of Medicine. And bienvenidos, mi gente. My name is Lisa Ponte Soto. I am the founding president and COO of Tanoma Consulting, the moderator for this webinar series. I'm a health equities researcher and evaluator trained in public health community participatory, culturally and linguistically appropriate practices. Tanoma Consulting is a national nonprofit consulting firm providing transformative, culturally responsive research, evaluation, and training services to advance health, education, and workforce equity. And for more information, you can visit us at www.tanomaconsulting.com. I want to quickly introduce our team. Ms. Xiomara Rodriguez, Director of Digital Presence Initiative at the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, or PRCC. Ms. Melissa Banerjee, Director of Development at the PRCC. Ms. Zenaida Lopez, Associate Director of El Rescate Transitional Living Program at the PRCC. Ms. Emily Medina Rodriguez, Research Associate with PRCC and Tanoma Consulting, and Ms. Kimberly Silva, Research Associate with Tanoma Consulting. We also want to introduce our liaisons for this program, Dr. Aida Giacello, Professor at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Preventative Medicine, Ms. Susana Gonzalez, Nurse Consultant and Educator with ASI Home Care and the non-Illinois chapter, Ms. Monica Rodriguez, from the All of Us program, who is the Director in Communications Engagement of the All of Us program at Northwestern University. We also would like to acknowledge our partners for this webinar series, the Illinois Precision Medicine Consortium for the All of Us project, comprised of 6 Chicago-based medical centers, the Puerto Rican Agenda of Chicago, a nonprofit organization comprised of Puerto Rican leaders ensuring the self-determination of Puerto Ricans in Chicago, throughout the diaspora, and in Puerto Rico through policy and advocacy. El Rescate Transitional Living, a program of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center of Chicago, which provides culturally appropriate identity-affirming housing for homeless, LGBTQ, and or HIV-positive youth, ages 18 to 24, through a continuum of solutions. Vida Sida, a program of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center that provides youth access to the HIV prevention services, as well as employment educational resources and living skills training. The Illinois chapter of the National Hispanic Nurses Association, a professional, voluntary, and nonprofit healthcare organization dedicated to enriching the lives of Hispanic nurses individuals through the promotion of academic attainment, mentorship, and professional development. And Illinois Unidos, a consortium of Latino clinicians, elected officials, public health practitioners, educators, and community organizers addressing inequities due to the impact of COVID-19 in the Latino communities and beyond. Before we begin, we want to get to know who is here with us today. So please enter your name in the chat, what organization you represent, and what city or neighborhood you're from. And welcome again. As we continue our programming today, please note that we're going to leave a few minutes at the end of our session for Q&A. So make sure you enter your questions or comments in the chat. And finally, this session is being recorded to make it available to you after this discussion. If you are following the conversation on Twitter, use the hashtags AllOfUsResearch PRCC-Chicago, Race Matters, Health Equity, or tag us at JACPRCC, at All of Us Research, at Tanuma LLC, at NNLMGMR, at NNLMAOU, or at Juan M. Calde. So now we're excited to introduce to you the CEO of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Mr. Juan Manuel Calderon. Juan is driven to confront injustices that people of color face daily, particularly the Latino LGBT community. He has leveraged community and government support to address great disparities in education and access to resources. Juan formerly assumed leadership of Vida Sida. Currently, he oversees several programs that can be standalone agencies. These include education, housing, public health, early childhood education, employment, urban agriculture, violence prevention, and arts and culture initiatives. He is a recognized activist and a celebrated community leader who advises local, state, and federal legislators. He is passionately active in policy efforts in Chicago City Council and the Illinois General Assembly. His recent accomplishments are many. You can read more about those on your screen. He also serves on the Chicago Board of Health as member and commissioner of the Board of Directors, and serves as the treasurer of the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture, the Richard Yates Local School Council, and the Stowe Elementary Local School Council, as well as the Illinois Commission on the Elimination of Poverty, and the Board of Directors for the Advocate Bethany Community Health Fund. And you can also see other affiliated organizations that he supports and represents. Among his many efforts, he's been recognized by La Voz del Paseo Boricua's Top 10 Under 30, Windy City's Times 30 Under 30, and DIFFA Chicago, IVI, IPO, Gay and Lesbian Caucus, Glenn Sudbury and Leadership Award for the National Center of Sex Education in Havana, Cuba. And Mr. Calderon has a bachelor's degree from Northeastern Illinois University, is currently pursuing a master's in public health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Mr. Calderon.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa Ponte, and I want to welcome everyone and welcome all of the panelists. I think that this is going to be a very fruitful conversation as we speak about history. The Puerto Rican Cultural Center is named after Juan Antonio Correger, who's a national poet, and he was very significant in a special song that all Puerto Ricans listen to, which is a poem that was created in our executive director's home called Boricua en la Luna. He was inspired in Chicago to create a poem that then spoke to, music called, I would be Puerto Rican even if I was born in the moon. So the Puerto Rican Cultural Center promotes the self-actualization, self-determination, and self-reliance of Puerto Rican Latino community through the study, recovery, and celebration of Puerto Rican culture. These efforts we can share and have been are undertaken annually through our events, such as the Three Kings Day Parade in January 6th. We have a large number of murals that the Puerto Rican Cultural Center has sponsored with our local artists. We are in the process of closing the Paseo Boricua Arts live-in workspace that is going to have a theater, as well as it's going to be able to house artists, 24 low-income artists in the community. And we will be able to promote culture and identity and have a location for them in the community. In addition to that, we have the Casita de Don Pedro Albizu Campos project that has its own small mini museum within the La Casita that we encourage participants to look at our website and research. In addition to that, we have the Puerto Rican Parade, Fiesta Boricua, and we play a big role in food and in illustrating cultural and identity And specifically in African American culture, Bomba en Plena, where we have multiple community partners and agencies that really beat the drums and that really continue to preserve identity within the lens of Latinos here and Puerto Ricans here in the city of Chicago. So once again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Calderon, again. Now we'll hear a few words from our sponsor.
On behalf of the network of the National Library of Medicine, I'm honored to partner with the Puerto Rican Cultural Center to bring trusted, meaningful health information to you. The National Library of Medicine is one of the 27 National Institutes of Health located on the NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland. It is the world's largest biomedical library, offering a vast print collection as well as electronic resources to researchers, health professionals, and the general public. The network of the National Library of Medicine consists of 8 regional academic medical libraries and over 9,000 partners nationwide that support the National Library of Medicine's mission to access and share health information and to raise awareness of the NIH All of Us research program to advance medicine, treatment, and care. And by funding partners like the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, together we can support the health information needs that are important to your community. So thank you for attending today's webinar. And if you would like to learn more about NNLM All of Us and the ways you or your organization can participate, learn, and work with us, please visit our website at nnlm.gov/allofus.
Fantastic. And you just heard from our sponsor, from the network of the National Library of Medicine's Greater Midwest Region Office, Darlene Caskey, who is the Community Engagement Coordinator. Now it's my esteemed pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker for today, Ms. Angela Ellison, Senior Director for the Office of Community Engagement and Neighborhood Health Partnerships, or OCEAN HP, which is part of the University of Illinois at Chicago. Prior to her role as Senior Director of OCEAN HP, Angela served as the Associate Director of Community at OCEAN HP. She is also an adjunct faculty for the South Suburban College Community Health Worker Certification Program, and she serves on positions that focus on community-based initiatives to improve the health and well-being of low-income, underprivileged individuals in the city of Chicago. She has also served on both city and federal task forces to review and provide input to improve the health and welfare of minorities in the city of Chicago. She has more than 30 years of experience addressing the social determinants of health with a focus on infant mortality and chronic disease. And so without further ado, I turn it over to Ms. Angela Ellison. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. She's introduced me. I'm Angela Ellison, Senior Director for the UIC Office of Community Engagement. And while I'm not specifically going to talk a lot about research, I am going to talk about community engagement. And I'm going to also add this disclaimer. While what I may say and talk about in the next 15 minutes or so may not be revolutionary, it may be stuff you already know and already hear, already have heard, I hope that it will make you think a little bit about your own story and how you can transform your own story to moving and making a change in the world. It may make you think about things a little differently, or at least say to yourself, aha, I'm in the right space and I'm doing the right thing. So hopefully you'll get a little bit out of what I'm going to talk about today, if my slides will advance. Okay, so as I talked about, I'm going to talk about our story from UIC and how we actually came to be. The OCEAN story, the OCEAN HP, how we tie our work to from our methods to our mission. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about myself and then gonna challenge you to do something with your own story. So in the beginning, in 1993, UIC resolved to direct its teaching, research, and partnership research toward improving the quality of life in Chicago. The University of Illinois is a land-grant institution, and it is committed to actually being a participant in what's happening in communities. It started, we went too fast, went a little too fast. We were a part of the Great Cities in this Institute in our very original origins. We were called the Office of the Neighborhood Initiatives. And the mission of the Great Cities Institute at the university is to support institutional engagement in urban research through creation, dissemination, and application of interdisciplinary knowledge that will improve the quality of life in metropolitan Chicago and other urban areas. That was the Great Cities Institute, and Ocean HP, then known as the Neighborhoods Initiative, was one of those arms where we carried forth that mission. The vision for UIC is to realize as a land grant institution to operate within the context of not only teaching and research and service, but doing it through an interdisciplinary approach. So at the time that this was created, and you guys look at this slide, you may say, that was in 1993. Is much change? And so I will say yes, but there was a lot going on. There was a lot of, I've been involved with the university since I began my work back in the mid 80s. And a lot of things were happening around the city. There was a silo mentality. There was a historical animosity of people saying the university just comes into communities and does research and takes that information and does anything with it. There's a lot of local and state politics. There's ethnic and racial tension. So much of that may sound very familiar today. So we're still in this struggle to improve lives. The Chancellor Emeritus now in 2020 put out his definition of community engagement, and it looks very similar to the Ocean Mission. He talks about, and I'm going to read this first sentence because I think it's important. Civic and community engagement are the heart of UIC. As a university created for and by the people of Chicago and Illinois, we have learned from and been transformed by the rich diversity of our surrounding communities and their people, and we embrace our mission to transform lives. And here, and I'm glad you'll get this printout, you can read in depth what this mission, what this definition includes: embracing a community, creating partnerships, and expanding our care delivery system. Our mission. As an Office of Community Engagement, our mission fosters partnerships, and you keep hearing that word, to bring together the expertise, resources, and wisdom from the community with that of the university to strengthen the quality of life for all beneficiaries. The Ocean HP mission is to promote health equity, revitalize historically underserved communities, build leadership capacity through service, education, and research. And I have to say, and I had to pause and I had to make sure this was included, we stand on some phenomenal shoulders. And one of those shoulders we stand is Dr. Cynthia Burns-Boyd. Dr. Cynthia Burns-Boyd was the founder of Ocean, then formerly a Neighborhoods Initiative. And Dr. Boyd was a visionary. She was committed to being an active and engaged partner with community and not for community. She made me understand that we are not saviors. We're not there to tell people what to do, but to be contributors, to be thought partners. She was very authentic in her delivery and what she believed in, and that message has passed on to my spirit, to be your authentic self. She was respectful of the rights, culture, and beliefs of all people, regardless of where they come from in their walks of life. And she viewed life and the things that we do through a glass half full. She understood that communities are not just places where bad things happen or where there are weaknesses, but there are strengths. And we must listen and learn and build upon those strengths. At its core, our concepts is not that we're not simply located in community. We are an engaged neighbor and partner with the responsibilities and the sentiments that are brought by that. We play a key role in continuously aligning the university's action to reflect this commitment to being a contributing partner. That's what Ocean is. We are the bridge from university to community and from community to the university. Through our work, we work with various partners. What we do, we provide services. So we are there to fill the gap in communities. We provide a lot of services today. We do that through direct programming. Some of our programs include Healthy Start, which is a maternal and infant mortality initiative operating on the south side of Chicago. We operate 5 school-based health centers in the city of Chicago that are comprehensive health centers that can see the entire family. They just happen to be located in schools. And we do that under the offices of Miles Square Health Center Enterprise, which is a federally qualified health center. We have a large SNAP-Ed USDA-funded initiative called the Chicago Partnership for Health Promotion, where we provide nutrition and physical activity education throughout the city. We also participate in system and policy changes to promote healthy lifestyle through major institutions such as Chicago Public Schools and Greater Food Depository. We are launching this month our own Community Health Worker Training and TA Center, where we will be training and providing webinars and educational services for community health workers within UIC and within the city. What we also do is we have our Healthy Cities Collaborative, and our Healthy Cities Collaborative is where we actually do engagement work. We participate through our Healthy City Collaborators and being that thought partner directly in communities, sitting at their planning tables, participating in their quality of life plans, as we are doing in Inglewood, Auburn, Gresham, and Brighton Park. So we sit there, we are part of the advisory boards. We have our own councils, our Partners Council and our Research Council that meet bi-monthly. And in these meetings, we invite faculty, community organizations, anyone who's interested. There's no membership fee, to be a part of us setting forth a community research agenda, to learn, to network, and to partner on key issues that impact the health of our communities. We host and have hosted annually, and certainly since this pandemic, many webinars that are addressing what is happening in the world today. We've hosted Black think tanks around COVID and addressing hesitancy in the African-American community, Latinx think tank. We're actually having our part 2 in a couple of weeks, focusing on mental health and the Latinx community. We've done Black women and Black men in America, which have focused on COVID and taking care of ourselves and mental health. We will also be hosting this year the importance of African Americans participating in clinical trials, research, and youth. So more to come from us on that. And so, as you can see, Healthy Cities is all about partnerships and building on the people and the strengths of those that we work with. So I'm going to pause here. And I said, I shared a little bit about Cynthia's story, Dr. Boyd. I'm going to share a little bit about my story and how I got here. And because I think it influenced, I know that it influenced how I do what I do and why I do what I do. Many years ago, I was driving to speak. I've been working in infant and maternal mortality since the mid-'80s on the west side of Chicago. And I was asked to come speak to a baby shower, community baby shower, about maternal mortality, because African-American women are 6 times more likely to die now from pregnancy-related complications than white women. And African-American babies are twice as likely to die, 3 to 4 times likely to die from within their first year of life than Caucasian babies. So I've been on this journey of improving health outcomes for people, but more specifically for women and babies for a very long time, 30 plus years. But on my way to this baby shower many years ago, I was just reflecting, and it suddenly dawned on me why this was so important to my spirit that I didn't even know. When that job came up in 1986, I said, this is something I've got to do. I owned it, I claimed it, I said, I got to work with these moms and babies. So as I was driving to that baby shower, it occurred to me, it says, Angela, my mother died in 1969. I was 9 years old. I was sitting in the beauty shop, getting my hair done, and I noticed my father and my aunties getting out the car across the street, and they were crying, and I didn't understand why they were crying. And he came into the barbershop and he said, my mother had just passed. And it was Christmas Eve, and I remember it so clearly. And I was a little confused and taken aback. And what had happened is my sister was born a month before. Her name is Claudette. She's in this picture. You see me with her. She has the glasses on, and I guess in my view, the far left corner of this picture. Claudette was born a month before, November 26th, and my mother had experienced some complications and was taken to the hospital. Had been there for like 3 weeks. She had some problems with her leg, and she ultimately died from a blood clot that went to her heart. So I realized, I said, maybe this is so important to me is because I'm not only working to help this, but this is part of my own story and my own journey. And so over the years, I had a couple of miscarriages, had my own concerns and interactions with the healthcare system, and understood its barriers from a very intimate space. That young man to the left sitting next to me is my one and only son that was born, and I'm very happy to say, Warren Ellison. And I realized over the lives that I think of all those places in the middle is my mother and my father. I realized over the years that story has led me to continue to be committed to trying to make a change in the lives of the people I touch and my staff and anybody who hears me say that statement often. And so when C and I've worked for C for many years, come together, we came from a mutual heart place and a commitment to use our own stories to try to make a difference. And so that's what I've been trying to do. So what we have learned as we have done this work is change the world one partnership at a time. What we have learned, what I have learned, is that most importantly to doing this work is you got to envision the change that you want to see. You got to see it, you got to believe it, you got to want it. You got to acknowledge that what you're building on is past harm that have been done to the communities that we're trying to serve. You got to go into those communities, recognize it, and value shared power. You may be the University of Illinois, or you may be the Illinois Department of Public Health, but the people living in those communities are the experts of their own experience, and we have to build on those experiences and make sure we respect those experiences and build upon them. We have to be our humble selves. And this sounds like a little funny thing, but this is something I learned from Dr. Boyd many years ago, is you don't leave the meeting when the food is served. And what happens is we as educators and presenters, we go into communities and go into these meetings and we present our stuff and then we go home. But understanding that communities of culture, that breaking of bread is equally as important. I guess this is when we can get back together again. This breaking of bread is equally important. So we need to be at the table from beginning to end and show that we are invested in those communities. We need to be at the planning table. But also your role, our role as representatives of organizations and institutions is hear the voices of the people in the community and use our own position and power. And I take this to heart, to elevate those voices to the people who don't care or can't hear them because they need to. And I have to be true to me. And one last thing, I have to share what Dr. Boyd said, is you got to be patient, because in communities, things don't move when we want them to do, and you got to be impatient. You got to understand that things need to move in certain places, like where we work, faster than we want them to. You got to know who you are, warts and all. I know what baggage I bring into the table, and I know when I have to close that baggage off, and when sometimes I have to air it just so that people understand I have that similar experience. You need to know who your community is and what that looks like and what you're really trying to do. Identify who the players are at the table. You have to be there. You have to stay there. You can't just go do your research and jump out. You got to be committed to the process and bring that research back to communities so they can build and learn from it. You can create mechanisms for regular communication. I can go on and on, but I only got a few minutes. Promote investment opportunities. Document and tell your story. Celebrate your story. Create opportunities for constructive play. The beneficiary should share and define the benefits. You need community input and buy-in, and you have to tune up often. What's your story? How can you do what you do to change the world? How are you changing the world? And how are you being on the right side of history? Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Ellison. So grateful to hear all of your words of wisdom, really insightful work, and also to hear you, pay homage and respect to the late Miss Cynthia Barnes Boyd. So next, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Angela Odoms-Young, who is Associate Professor and Director of Nutrition, Obesity and Health Equity Research Laboratory with the Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Odoms-Young also serves as Associate Director for Research and Education for Ocean HP, where her responsibilities include supporting staff in SNAP ED. Dr. Odoms-Young has over 20 years of experience in diversity and equity research, teaching and training, and community engagement in the fields of public health, nutrition, and medicine. Her research explores the social and structural determinants of dietary behaviors and related health outcomes in low-income and Black and Latinx populations, and identifying culturally appropriate programs and policies that promote health equity, food justice, and community resilience. Dr. Odoms-Young has over 200 academic publications, yes, over 200, book chapters and presentations, and has served on numerous advisory committees and boards, including the National Academy of Sciences Food and Nutrition Board, the Institutes of Medicine committees to develop the nutritional standards of the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and to revise the food packages provided in the Supplemental Program for Women, Infants, and Children, and Council on Black Health. She's a local board member at the General Chicago Food Depository, American Heart Association Chicago Metro Board, Grow Greater Englewood, and Blacks in Green. Dr. Odoms-Young is also current chair of the American Heart Association of Chicago and is citywide health advisory under the Citywide Health Advisory Committee. She received her Bachelor of Science in Foods and Nutrition from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana and has a master's and PhD in community and nutrition from Cornell University. Dr. Odoms-Young also completed a Family Research Consortium postdoctoral fellowship examining family processes in diverse populations at the Pennsylvania State University and the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and a Community Health Scholars Fellowship in Community-Based Participatory Research at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And so without further ado, we turn the presentation over to Dr. Odoms-Young.
Thank you, Dr. Aponte Soto, who I've known for many years. And so it is a pleasure, and also to be in the presence of the longstanding legacy of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, which of course has a history of advocacy and social justice in Chicago. I'm a native Chicagoan, South Sider, and I still reside on the South Side. And so this means kind of more to me than just a research endeavor. It is really rooted in life and wellness of the people that I love and that I'm surrounded with, as Angela mentioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about African-American engagement in research and really provide a historical perspective. There was a report that came out from Chicago Beyond in their equity series, and Karen Jackson, who was the director of the workforce development for the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, I was really struck by this quote. She said, when Dr. King was assassinated in the 60s, we were doing studies in North Lawndale and Garfield. And here it is almost 60 years later, we have been studied for years and years and years. What is the positive outcome we are going to see for these studies we are always doing? Will it be in these young men's lifetimes while they are still in their 20s? And so the question is what is the impact of research? And when we think about participation in research, how does research relate to a better life for the people that are being engaged in that research? If we look at just the definition of research without thinking about how it's applied, and this is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So research is defined as a careful or diligent search, a studious inquiry or examination, especially investigation or experimentation, aimed at the discovery and interpretation of facts, revision of accepted theories or laws in the light of new facts, or practical application of such new or revised theories of laws. It includes collecting information about a particular subject and careful study that is done to find and report new knowledge. And I think that's really important when you think about BIPOC populations, or we're talking about African-American populations, but when you think about people of color overall, who has control of that new knowledge, who decides what is new knowledge, and who decides who is the collector or documenter of that new knowledge. So when we think about the idea of barriers, so if we talk about research, traditionally we've had the idea, particularly contemporary perspective, that people of color do not want to participate, that they do not want to participate in research. So the idea that there are these barriers, and there's been tons and tons of studies that talk about barriers to participation, and a lot of these are related to the now, but we know that there's a legacy that precedes this that and maybe serves as a barrier or encourages people from a cognitive perspective not to participate, and also a tangible perspective not to be interested in participating in research, although I want to challenge the idea of not interested. So this was a report from Ford and colleagues in 2007. is not very different than what we see today in papers around barriers to clinical trial participation. This is around cancer trials, but perceived harms of clinical trial participation, loss of control, so some uncertainty about treatment, the nature of the intervention, so what types of interventions are people being asked to engage in, what time it takes, so more tangible barriers like loss of income. But I really want to point us to some of these more social and, as I mentioned, cognitive barriers like mistrust of research and the medical system, fear, factors related to patient-provider relationship or perception of the provider, as well as the earlier perceived harms of clinical trial participation and loss of control. We've seen a lot of this narrative, not only as it relates to research, but also COVID vaccines, what's happening right now of our people engaging with the healthcare system in a very sort of mutually beneficial relationship. And then how do they feel about the parties, as in number 9, how do people feel about the patient, about the provider? How do people feel about the researcher? How do they feel about the public health system? All of these things play a big role when you think about participation in research from a more smaller perspective. So we talk about research studies, but I think in a broader perspective as well, how do we engage more generally, even with the idea of treatment? And I would love to talk more about that because that has just been a prevalent topic of discussion around vaccine hesitancy. So the definition of research is actually quite benign. It's not as if people of color are not interested in solving problems, generating new knowledge, looking at facts, discovering solutions to things that ail certain communities. They're not interested in scientific racism. So it's not research itself, but it's the history of scientific racism that has been coupled to research. And I want to talk a little bit about the origin of this and the history, and then recommend some possible solutions and then some thoughts for discussion. So we all know that race is a social construct that was developed in the early 1500s that was used to describe and categorize people into various social groups based on characteristics like skin color, physical features, and a belief in genetic heredity. But when we think about scientific racism, and again, racism is not race is not the leader. Traditionally, people thought as racism as the leader because race was created and driven by racism. And there's a lot of documentation to talk about that. So if we think about this in the context of research, who is conducting the research becomes important. What is the purpose of the research? How have the results been used, both currently and in the past? And then what is the benefit for those that are directly engaged in the research? What is the benefit to the overall community? And what is the cost? And this is really important when we look at what's happening today, but also what has happened over time. Who has been given control and authority to be the researcher, and who is the community that's being researched? And then what is the purpose of that research, even if it's not directly related or very explicit? It has implications for overall perceptions, policies, and practices that may impact communities in a broader way. So science is rooted in historical timelines of oppression. It's not that science is separate from what's happening in society overall. And this is a timeline of the African/African experience in the United States, where originally people of color were treated as property and then treated as second-class citizens, and then still living today with the effects of structural racism. If you look at the history, of course, slavery and Jim Crow lasted longer than what we think of as the more contemporary issues of racial inequity. So the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and I was born in 1968. So the idea that freedom or freedom from some discrimination or legal discrimination is only really in the last several decades as compared to a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And that becomes really important when we think about participation of African Americans in research. Part of this is because society has been rooted in the concept of structural violence. So this unfair treatment, and I'm just going to go back, that we see over many years is deeply rooted in society, and we can look at that as structural violence. So we see certain acts that we see, or direct violence, but underlying this is structural violence. So structural violence really highlights those negative consequences as it relates to distribution of power. And so we see the negative effects, but structural violence is what's underlying those negative effects. And then cultural violence is being used to reinforce the structural violence. And this is the case of scientific racism. So if we look at direct violence as compared to structural violence, we see direct violence at the individual level, and structural violence is at the collective level. Structural violence is targeted against social groups, where direct violence is targeted against individuals. Structural violence is what we see in society, and so it's faceless, where direct violence, we look at an actor and then a party that is the quote unquote victim of that violence, but structural violence is normalized within society. This pyramid, similar to the pyramid of structural and cultural violence by Johan Galton, you see that we have these overt, if we think of white supremacy, things that are viewed as socially unacceptable. But we also have the socially acceptable. So things that are rooted, so the school to prison pipeline, all of these things, mass incarceration, police brutality. So one might say, how does this relate to participation in research? But if we see that this underlying structural violence is at the root of the African American experience in the United States, then participation in science or research becomes a question about, is this really going to solve real world problems, or what is the purpose of these investigations? Are we generating new knowledge, or is that knowledge that's going to be generated being used to reinforce that structure of discrimination? So part of this, when you look at the role of science, we have it at multiple levels. It tends to be down at the bottom, although there has been science and a history of science that has been linked to genocide or bias motivated violence, but we still have this idea of bias attitudes and the questions that we ask and acts of bias. So when we talk about things like bias mental models and systemic discrimination. So who's conducting the research? So if we look at the root of science and scientific racism, the picture on the left is really what was happening at the time. Again, slavery or an enslavement of African people. And a lot of that was justified in the science of inferiority. If you look on the right of the idea of the skull studies that look at, intelligence as well as, what is the hierarchy or racial hierarchy. So this racial hierarchy was believed to be invented by science. And again, that legacy can have an impact on what happens today. Science and practice have always been related. So who's conducting the research and for what purpose? And this racial hierarchy of science also reinforced later events within practice. So if we look at legalized sterilization programs that had a shift over time as integration increased, forced sterilization increased. So the idea that the racial hierarchy continues to reinforce policy. So if you look at participation in research, if people have an understanding that the research is not for their own liberation and their own healing and well-being, then many people, even if they're not intentionally thinking, I don't want to participate in this study, the legacy and the history has been passed down of mistrust. A good example of this was coined by Fannie Lou Hamer, the Mississippi appendectomy, which some people are probably familiar with from the 1920s to the 1980s, that really characterizes forced sterilization, where people went in for a variety of conditions but came out sterilized instead. But this narrative of structural violence also is contrasted of cultural violence in science. And if we look at the legacy of Black scientists, it's important that although we have this history of mistrust and scientific racism and oppression that's happening, over these same years, you have very accomplished Black scientists like Alice Ball, who helped discover the cure for leprosy or treatment for leprosy. Of course, George Washington Carver, which we know, and Ernest Everett Just, who is viewed as the Black Apollo of science, who made several discoveries around fertilization and was a biologist by training. And so although you have this sort of contrast of scientific oppression, you also have this legacy of scientific excellence that becomes part of that cultural oppression, that people don't understand the legacy of Blacks in science. So in the Chicago Beyond report that I mentioned earlier, they talked about 7 inequities held in place by power and 7 opportunities for change in research. And I know Angela talked about these when it comes to community engagement. So when we look at access, who's missing? Are we missing out on community wisdom that could be part of these conversations? Can we effectively partner to get at the truth? What is the truth? Whose truth are we looking at? What's valid? Who owns research? What's valued and how is value generated? What is accountability to do no harm? And then who's publishing? Who's in the role of authorship? And so just to close, I'm going to just briefly mention some of the projects that we're working on in the nutrition, obesity, health equity, and food justice research laboratory, where we engage and work alongside communities. Some of the projects like our Breastfeeding Equity Learning Collaborative with the Institute for Health, IPHI. And so I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over back to Lisa.
Thank you, Dr. Odoms-Young. Wow, I don't even know how we begin to unpack all of that information, but also important and relevant to today's context and where we're at presently, and echoes the importance of inclusion in research of all communities, but particularly those communities that have been most marginalized and affected in a negative way by research and lack of inclusion in a thoughtful way. So we will now open, we have very limited time, but we will open and take at least a couple of questions.
I have one question here from Emily. It says, this is such a timely and deep topic. I really appreciate both researchers' time and the resources they have brought. My question is, from our personal practice, what things we cannot fail to do when talking about inclusion in the African American community?
So I think that I do want to hear you respond to this too as well, Angela, is that to Angela as well. I think when you're talking to the African American community, you have to recognize what Angela talks about is the historical framework. And then you have to make it relevant to the moment. This has been my experience. I am actually participating in one of my first clinical trials right now. And so because it was important to me to understand it, which is why I decided to participate, because I too had many of those fears and concerns, et cetera, that Angela O talked about, is that you've got to really be able to make it relevant. And so when you talk to the African-American community, you can't go in there blind and acknowledge like history doesn't exist and like they don't remember it or don't know it. You have to acknowledge that out front. This is my opinion. And then make it relevant why they should participate. That is going to be our approach as an organization as well. Angela O.
Yeah, I would agree, because most people don't think about big historic events. They think about things that happen in their family. So if you went to the hospital and you never came back, or you participated in a study, or there was some research done and nobody knew what happened. So part of it is usually it's not this historic experience. The historic experiences are passed through families. So it's important that you engage individuals, but also we need to start engaging families and communities and really have some agreement around ethics, which we do through the IRB, but community ethics, it's like a community benefits agreement that communities should be able to talk about what is it that they want to have when it comes to research, and then have researchers be able to also have some agreement with some of those requests that happen at a broader way.
Okay, and we have one more question by Dr. Giacello. What strategies can be implemented by researchers to recruit African Americans?
I think it's two things. It's the more, social response and the tangible. Some people have barriers to participating. And so we have to deal with those tangible barriers, transportation, having research at community sites versus far away at universities. So if somebody's going to come from a far distance to UIC, that's very difficult. So we need tangible products. And then we also need to have questions that are relevant to communities. And so I think that those are two ways to recruit, by partnering with some of those backbone organizations and being able to come and present the research question and let people respond to it before the grant is submitted. So that's very difficult to do, I know, but people have to be involved before we ask the questions. And I know, Aida, you've had a long history of community engagement.
Just like any other community, I have to trust the messenger. And so for just to send out a call for people to join research to communities means nothing. Having people like community health workers are impactful on so many levels, but they are the ones who are the trusted members of communities in many cases. And African-American community health workers in African-American communities who want to get some research done, use those people who have feet on the ground, boots on the ground, to help get the message out there why this is important and to do the recruitment. You can't do it by blind emails or blast or things like that. You have to have people who can sit down, answer questions, and make it real for them and help them understand what this means. And most importantly, we got to come back and close the loop when we do research in communities. Don't just go do research and then the community never understood why you came to do that and they have never heard anything about it anyway.
Indeed. Thank you both. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, but we do really sincerely appreciate both of your insights and all the information that you've been able to share, and most definitely want to acknowledge and recognize the amazing work that you all do to authentically engage community, to really emulate that work. Similarly to the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, as Juan stated, by honoring history and taking that to the next level with humility and that organic engagement of community for the sake of the community's health and wellness. We do have a few announcements before we close. As you continue to explore opportunities to engage in research and how you can be part of that representation, we invite you to learn more about the All of Us program. You can visit joinallofus.org to learn more about the program there. And now I will turn things over for a couple of announcements from the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. Xiomara?
Okay, hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes. So just a couple announcements. I don't know if everybody was able to join us last weekend, but part of our healing and celebrating our joy and resilience is our Holgorio de Salsa y Más happening every Saturday outside to support our local vendors and businesses on Paseo Boricua. And I am curating some performances every Saturday. So this Saturday we have Linda Sol and she is going to be performing some poetry and music and having a DJ set. We're going to have a couple at the beginning. So she's going to be performing at 2 p.m. At 12 p.m. until 2, we're going to be having a little bit of salsa dancing going and some classes for kids. So definitely come out on Saturday at 2559 West Division Street to join us and have some joy. And then the other announcement is that we are continuing our education class series, and we changed it to education class, not just nutrition, because we're moving on beyond just educating about nutrition, but about movement and all types of all of the factors that go into our health. And so that series is continuing to go on in April, May, and June. So definitely sign up for those, and I hope to see everybody on Saturday. Thanks.
Thank you, Xiomara. And we do have a few announcements. If you want to continue the conversation and learning more about how we can address colorism, racism, and discrimination, not just in the African-American community, but in our own Latinx community, join us this Friday with soon-to-be Dr. Angel Velez for a conversation about colorism, racism, and discrimination. And that event is at 4:30. It starts at 4:30. His talk will start at 5, and you can use the QR code or the Zoom link there to join us. Also, as we continue to talk about honoring history and engaging community in research, we will have a conversation next Wednesday at 1 p.m. with Leonie Calderon from the Puerto Rican Cultural Center and Dr. Ruth Zambrana from the University of Maryland School of Public Health, as well as our own Dr. Aida Giachelo, as we continue to talk about our own history. You heard Dr. Odoms-Young talk about the sterilization in the African-American community. In our Puerto Rican culture, we have our own history of how women were sterilized without consent. So it's important that we continue to learn and honor history so that we can avoid those reoccurrences and be able to own our presence in research and our contributions in research. And then you can join us to continue the conversation. You heard Dr. Odoms-Young talk about the importance of representation in research is not just participation as research participants, but also as the researchers driving this work. And so you will have many examples of how we can engage, not just with community, but as researchers, and continue to come together in community to drive this work. We have 2 days of a Puerto Rican Health Summit, as we will talk about pipeline development and what that looks like in terms of the educational pipeline of researchers, academics, and clinicians, as well as many other great topics. And then finally, we will close our series on April 28th, as we will talk about recruiting and retaining Latinx older adults in research, as we think about research and research engagement across the continuum and how we need engagement so that we can learn about appropriate practices across the continuum. We will be joined by Dr. Marta Cerda and Dr. David Marquez. And we want to hear from you. So please complete the post-session evaluation. We will be sending out to you with an announcement and details about today's event, as well as the recording. But if you want to learn more about Dunaway Consulting, please send us an email with any feedback at info@dunawayconsulting.com. You can visit Puerto Rican Cultural Center at prcc-chgo.org. And you can contact any of today's speakers with the information that you see posted there on your screen. And again, before we go, we ask that you take a moment to reflect on how you can take a part of addressing anti-racism with regards to your role in society or professionally. We each have a collective responsibility to each other. You have learned today about how we can work with community partners and community members to incorporate programming and research that isn't about our well-intended personal agendas, but rather that meets community where it is and places their voices front and center in the decision-making process that acknowledges community and that does it by acknowledging and building on their assets and strengths. Take time to learn about the resources of the Juan Antonio Correger Puerto Rican Cultural Center and the UIC Ocean HP program. Ask questions, engage with community, listen, learn, and let community lead. Thank you again. On behalf of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center of Chicago, muchísimas gracias, Juan, Angela, and Dr. O, for your time today. Thank you all. Also, a special thanks to our sponsor, the Network of the National Library of Medicine. We hope that everyone considers joining the All of Us program. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Be kind and loving to one another. Plain and simple, mi gente. Lean on love, compassion, and empathy. Together we can make a difference. Peace and love.